Okay, so today we're going to be discussing the arts and crafts movement and the Prairie School. The Prairie School being actually a subset or component of the overall arts and crafts movement. So the movement that we call the arts and crafts begins about 1850. Essentially, it comes out of England and spreads around the country or around the world, and is very popular in parts of Europe and especially popular in the United States. And essentially is considered by historians to end in 1914, which is the beginning of World War I. The sort of romanticism and philosophies that drove the movement were pretty much destroyed by this massive conflagration that starts in 1914 and ends that. So the movement overall is a reaction to the Industrial Revolution. It is when we talked about that earlier in the semester, it really led to a massive change in society, in people moving from more rural and farm, agrarian-based culture to an urban, dense culture, to working, 10, 12-hour days, sometimes more, for low wages and tenement housing, very dense, low quality housing, and so forth. And it also led in some ways to a loss of craftsmanship. A lot more could be produced by factory, by mechanical means, and very little was created by hand anymore, which had its advantages, of course: lower costs, more able, you can make a lot more in a lot faster time, and so people had the ability to buy things and to improve their lives to a certain extent. But there was a certain reaction to the loss of this handcrafted quality that happened before the Industrial Revolution. There was a sense, too, that with mass-produced goods, it meant that people might not value material things as much anymore. When you had to pay a lot, when it was difficult to make it and to acquire it, there might be more value placed on it than something that was cheap and you could just buy, and if it broke or you lost it or something, you could just buy it again. And that led to a certain overconsumption. And we talked about the transformation of rural society to an urban one, and the fact that people were more dictated by the clock and by, the whistles. You had to be to the factory at a certain time, and you were there until the whistle blew and you could go home, and you had less time with family and for personal reasons, I suppose. And it also ended the craft guilds that had ruled manufacturing prior to the Industrial Revolution, when things were made by hand and when it took a lot of skill and a lot of effort for someone to learn how to acquire those skills. And so, and all of those were very legitimate for the most part, and some of those we even face today in the sort of computer revolution that we live in today. You can apply some of those same things, and some of those same issues are raised by philosophers and others in today's world, and the impact, negative or positive, that might have on our culture and society. And so out of this reaction to the Industrial Revolution comes the arts and crafts movement. And the principles behind it are this return to a handcrafted manufacturing. As we'll see, there's sort of an understanding and a realization that there's a limit to, we can't completely go back to a pre-industrial revolution manufacturing, but there is the idea of the movement is that we ought to value and appreciate handcrafted goods when we can. There's also a look to nature as inspiration for art and for architecture and other things. And that's part of that reaction to people moving into dense urban environments and away from, agrarian farm environments, and so there was more limited contact that people could have in their everyday lives with nature. There is an idealization of a medieval society, which is the pre-industrial revolution society, almost to a romanticism of it that didn't meet the realities of what life was like in the medieval age. But when people look to the past, they tend to romanticize the positives and forget about some of the negatives that might have been in that past as well. And that's certainly true for the arts and crafts movement. And of course, from an architectural standpoint, there was a belief that an architecture should reflect these social values, and that should be more of the land and of the people, and not of this machine age, factory, industrial revolution that's occurring. And really can sum it up in a quote that is often used by arts and crafts followers of truth and beauty. The idea there's a truth to something that is in nature or made by human hands, and there's a beauty to that as well. And there's also a religious overtone, as we'll see with the next slide, John Ruskin. John Ruskin is, you could probably consider him the father of the arts and crafts movement. He was English, and really came in the middle of the 19th century as the primary philosophical figure of the arts and crafts movement. He wasn't an architect, but his ideas and writings really helped to spread the concepts and philosophies of the arts and crafts movement. And he based it largely on a strong Christian value that had a certain underpinning in the arts and crafts movement, but in many cases was sort of left off as it developed, especially in architecture. And the most critical thing that Ruskin produced was a book called The Seven Lamps of Architecture in 1849. And so this really is what kicks off the arts and crafts movement about 1850. And his seven lamps were sort of breaking down the seven principles that he saw that we ought to highlight or emphasize in reaction to the Industrial Revolution. And those are sacrifice, which is a dedication of man's craft to God; truth, the handcrafted and honest display of materials and structure; power, buildings should reach for the sublimity of nature by using the human mind to organize the effort to build them; beauty, an aspiration towards God expressed in ornamentation from nature; life, buildings created by human hands expressing their joy in its creation; memory, buildings should respect the culture from which they are created; and obedience, originality should not be for its own sake, but based on, in his case, English values. So you can see there's definitely that religious influence coming from Ruskin, some of which is sort of minimized by others as they come later. But these principles, and especially the descriptions, I think we'll see over and over again displayed in the architecture of the arts and crafts movement. And the first major work of the arts and crafts is a house called Red House. It's in Bexley Heath, Kent, just outside of London. Designed and built 1859-1860. The primary architect was Philip Webb, but William Morris was both the client and the principal designer, and really would be credited with the overall design of it. Webb was more of a collaborator in helping Morris with some of the more technical aspects of design and construction. Morris himself wasn't an architect, but he was a very talented designer, and probably the most important early principle of the arts and crafts movement. He was quite wealthy and very artistically talented, painting. He began publishing books, but handcrafted books, not books that were printed in a mass-produced printing press, but were more like the medieval monks, creating hand-written with drawings and images within them. He did a line of wallpapers. I'll show you an example of that. You can still buy Morris designed wallpapers and fabrics, and was a very important and influential aspect in the figure in the design world, and still is today, really. This is a quote from a book, a hand-printed book that he did, Kelmscott Manor, and it talks about a house and what a house ought to be. And I just want to quote a couple of lines from it, about a few words about a house that I love, with a reasonable love, I think. And notice as you kind of read through it, he talks about charm. How much charm a house should have, and that it should grow out of the soil and the lives of the people that live in it, and that it shouldn't be designed by what he calls an office architect, that it ought to be more organic, right? And it should sort of come about from the people who are living within it. And that he talks about the delight of the meadow and the acre and the wood and the river. That's that connection to nature I talked about. And even, throws in the idea of common sense, again, maybe a contrast to the idea of the office architect, that anyone who understands what a house ought to be should be able to design and create a house. So you can pull out those terms out of this, and you can see that the concept of a home in the arts and crafts movement is something that is very emotive. There's a strong emotional contact, and it isn't just a structure with a roof on it to provide you shelter from wind and rain or something like that. It is something that has special meaning and connection to the people that live there and to the land around it and so forth. It's a very romanticized idea, of course, but it's something that really takes hold and will carry through for pretty much all of the arts and crafts architecture, especially the residences that we'll be talking about today. Here's a couple of examples of William Morris wallpaper. Like I say, you can still buy his fabrics and wallpaper today. So here is some images of Red House, creatively named because it has red brick. The house is just outside of London, and it was built intentionally to look like a medieval manor house. This is a looking back at this medieval age as something more appropriate, and the way that people ought to live and have that connection to land and to nature at the time. And the materials he uses are a more hand-pressed type of brick rather than a machine factory, very smooth, very sharp cut edges. Slate or clay tiles. You see lots of chimneys, which indicate the idea of having lots of fireplaces throughout the house to provide warmth throughout. You can also see, let me get my clicker on here, or pointer, you can also see the pointed arches throughout that are typical of Gothic or medieval architecture that we had talked about last semester. Here are the floor plans, and if you look at the ground floor plan towards the top, you notice there's a central hall, and this is a common feature in many arts and crafts homes, and it harkens back to the grand central hall of medieval houses and castles as well, that people gathered in one big hall with a giant walk-in fireplace, and that's where most of life occurred. And so this hall, although not quite as large as one might have been in the medieval era, is overscaled. It's not an entry vestibule, it's a big grand entry hall that connects that to that medieval philosophy. This is the rear view. The house, as you can see, is laid out on an L shape, and it's also very meandering. This is arts and crafts houses are not typically going to be symmetrical and rigid and ordered. They're going to be picturesque. They're going to be meandering with wings and dormers and different roof lines. There's even a charming little slate-covered well in the courtyard where, idealistically one walks out to go get the fresh water every morning. So it's this really, the whole overall design and planning of the house fits to that romantic ideal of the medieval life. A few other details, I think in these photographs you can see better the more handcrafted quality of the brick and the small windows set in pointed arched openings. Here's some details of the chimneys and the copper weather vane. You can see on the left here in this bay window are the typical leaded pane windows, diamond pane of medieval construction. And here's a view of that grand entry hall. So as you can see, it's a wide open hall. This is not just an entry vestibule or a small minimal circulation space, and it has this grand wood staircase at the end. Wood is tends to be in the arts and crafts movement natural. It has a stained and varnished finish on not as much painted, which was more typical prior to this era. So you see a lot of the natural woodwork. The woodwork itself becomes crafted in a way that is more medieval in character, with big wide planks and so forth. Here's a view of the entry door. You can see it has cast iron hinges and hardware on it that makes it look like a more medieval door with some leaded art glass windows in there as well. This is the top of the stair. You get a better view of the staircase. Again, you can see the sort of pointed brick arch and some of the heavy timber beams up here in the exposed ceiling to sort of reflect the idea of that heavy timber construction that was medieval in character. And this is what they call the drawing room. This would be a main sort of living space, and it has that giant, almost walk-in fireplace that commands, one whole side of the room that was characteristic of a medieval manor house as well. Here's a view of some of the art glass windows. Again, art glass was very common. That harkens back to Gothic stained glass windows, and you have to make these, at least at this time, by hand. Later, they'd be made, in a factory and ordered in a catalog and put into bungalows in Chicago. Here's another quote by Oscar Wilde from a publication or article called Art and the Handicraftsman from 1882. And this is representing some of the changes in philosophy that will evolve in the movement over time. And Wilde is really addressing the conflict between handcrafting and machine factory made. And Wilde is saying, okay, we know that factory production and factory made goods are here, and there's a place for them. There's a lot of things that could be and should be made in a factory, and it'll reduce the costs and make it more available to people. But he says somewhere in the middle here, let us have no machine-made ornament at all. Ornamentation is something that ought to be, in his view, crafted by hand. It should come from humans and not machines. It's all bad and worthless and ugly, according to him. And he talks about, machine making can do things that take the soul out of humanity, but certain things like ornamentation or something can provide value to people's soul, I suppose, in his view. And he says, steam engines, telephones, and so forth, they all have their place. They'll all have their purposes, but we shouldn't let that sort of overtake our own social values and spirit. And again, I think one can sometimes apply similar questions or lessons in today's world with computers. There's ongoing debates about screen time and whether we've lost touch with people because they text and FaceTime instead of having direct contact, which of course is somewhat ironic right now in our current pandemic. But that sort of debate has been ongoing for the last 20 years or so. And from an artistic standpoint, the movement is represented in something called the PreRaphaelites. And there's a group of artists that call themselves the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. And that's a small group of English painters and artists, and they have a great influence across the world and in the US. And this is an example by one of them, Edward Burne-Jones. And the idea behind this art movement is that it's taking art before Raphael, before the Renaissance is where we started at the beginning of the semester. And the dress and figures become more medieval in their appearance, and we see more natural landscapes and so forth, like we see here. This painting here by John William Waterhouse, one of the really best artists of this movement, also is a tie. You can see the tie to nature and this romantic view of of life and so forth. And this is a mythological theme where Hylas is goes to a pond to gather some water, and he's seduced and drawn in by these water nymphs and disappears forever. And this has some of that moralistic undertones as well that it pervades in the early arts and crafts movement about the morality and not being distracted and seduced, I guess, by beautiful women or something like that. But there's definitely some of that religious moralistic undertone in the painting. The most acclaimed artist was Dante Gabriel Rossetti. He was the leader of the Brotherhood, and this is one of his paintings. And again, you can see very strong connections to nature in there, and a sort of distorted figures slightly that harken back to a little less of the realism that emerges in the Renaissance art, and back to slightly more abstract pre-Renaissance medieval art. Another painting by Rossetti. I think the model for this was William Morris's wife, Jane Morris, whom they were very close, and word is that they were actually quite intimate and had an affair together. Rossetti was quite troubled and actually died young of a drug overdose, unfortunately. So from an architecture standpoint, one of the primary early figures in England was CFA Voisey, and the example I'll give of his work is Broadlays on Lake Windermere. This is in the Lake District of England, and it dates from 1898. Voisey was a very strong proponent of the arts and crafts movement. He really believed strongly in the principles of the movement itself and created an architecture that he felt reflected those principles. And was an early, almost proto-modernist architect. If we compare to the Red House, which looked straight out of a medieval manor house, in the case of Voisey, his was still had an influence of medieval architecture, but in a slightly more modern way. And I'll show you the exterior. I think you'll see that pretty clear in a moment. Here's the floor plan. It, like Red House, is an L shape with bay windows and protrusions coming out. The entrance is here in the courtyard, and you come into a big giant hall with a stair off to the side, and this big black area here is the fireplace, and the bay windows look out over the great view, which is out towards the lake. This is essentially a weekend or summer house for a wealthy client. One of the ironies of the arts and crafts movement is it's easy to argue that it was a somewhat elitist movement in that you had to have a fairly decent amount of money to afford handcrafted goods and handcrafted architecture. And so there was always a struggle. Even Frank Lloyd Wright attempted to make houses for the common man, but they were always more expensive than he wanted, and had really struggled throughout most of his career to create an affordable architecture. So this is the exterior view of it. You can see the 3 bay windows that look out over the lake, which is behind. And the architecture here, it still has that medieval character, the tall slate roofs, the chimneys with the multiple chimney stacks there, flues that you can see. But he strips down the exterior to plain stucco most of the time, and kind of eschews a lot of extraneous ornamentation on his houses, especially on his exteriors. And it's not quite a modernist architecture, but I think modernist architects are somewhat influenced by this in the early 20th century, as we'll see a little later. Here's a rendering of the house with the floor plans. And again, you can see some minor details and ornamentation, like the brackets under the eaves here. But for the most part, it's plain white stucco on the exterior. Here's the entry court with the entrance there. And again, you see the white stucco, just a little bit of stonework detail around the windows. And you do see the leaded glass windows, which is typical of medieval construction. And a view of the great hall when you enter, with the bay window that looks out over the lake. There's that giant walk-in fireplace with the pointed arch that looks medieval. Lots of natural woodwork throughout, including the heavy timbered beams up in the open ceiling area. Perhaps the most famous and accomplished of the British arts and crafts architects is Charles Rennie Mackintosh. He's actually Scottish, and his greatest work is arguably Glasgow School of Art, designed 1897 and built up through 1909. So Mackintosh was Scottish and was incredibly talented. A lot of people compare him, sort of call him the British version of Frank Lloyd Wright, partly because their designs and furniture and so forth were so similar in many ways. They probably were familiar with each other through publications, but they never had any direct contact. Wright was part of this broader arts and crafts movement. He tended to downplay people and move other ideas that influenced him to emphasize his own creativity and talents. But there's no question in the 1880s and 90s that he was absorbing large amounts of ideas from other people and other places. And it would then blossom into the Prairie School, as we'll see here, about 1900. Mackintosh was also married, as we'll see in a moment, to Margaret MacDonald, who was a very talented artist and designer in herself. Sadly, Mackintosh's career was somewhat short-lived. He was a strong adherent to the philosophies of the arts and crafts movement, unlike many architects and designers who sort of adapted it because it was popular and that's what their clients wanted, and they might be very talented at creating an arts and crafts architecture, but they didn't necessarily believe in its philosophy at its heart. Mackintosh truly believed in it and had a hard time adjusting to the end of the movement and the changes to other styles and directions in architecture and design. And so after 1914 especially, he really fell into obscurity. So here's a historic exterior view of Glasgow School of Art, and this is a architecture and design school, and so it's designed to reflect that. You can see along the left are these huge open window areas that open into the classroom and studio spaces so that the students would have lots of natural light for their painting classes and their drafting and so forth. It's stone and it has, again, it's not particularly symmetrical. There's a certain balance, the front facade we see on the left, but it is not the strong symmetry that one might expect out of something machine made or of the Industrial Revolution. On the right, we see these tall bay windows that are smaller panes of glass. That's the library that I'll show you in a moment. Here is one of my views of it. I was there in 2009 and got a tour of it, which was fantastic. This is the main entry, and you can see again, there's not a symmetry here at the entry, but there is a certain balance. that occurs here. And we see bay windows with small panes. We see lots of beautiful ironwork here at the big windows and the gates and so forth at the entranceway, and the beautiful stonework. So it has this medieval character, but what's great about Mackintosh is he is not slavishly recreating a medieval building like Morris did really at Red House. He's really creating an architecture that's influenced by medieval architecture, but is of its own time. Here we get a better detailed view of some of the beautiful ironwork that he created here. The floor plan is pretty straightforward. We see the entrance down at the bottom in the center and a long corridor, and here you see these giant classroom studio spaces. And up here in the upper right, where we see these bay windows, this is the library space, which was arguably the pièce de résistance of the school here. And this is a view from the back corner showing where the library is with these tall, it was a tall multi-level library space that had a big mezzanine that went around the main reading room area. And here was my photograph of it from 2009. And they didn't allow photographs, unfortunately, on the interior, so these are some photos I found online, not the best quality maybe, but you can see that natural woodwork that we talked about. The furniture has a certain medieval character, big wide planks and so forth, but again designed in a very contemporary manner. It isn't just a replication of medieval furniture, it's something of its own time and place. Beautiful light fixtures that hang down over the reading desk here. There you can see the mezzanine that goes around the top. And this view here is standing in the mezzanine looking down at the reading room, and you can see all of the incredible woodwork in here. So in 2014, some of you may have heard about this, this happened. A fire started right near the end of class term. One of the students was finishing touches on his project and in studio, and I guess was using maybe a little flame or something like that, and his model caught fire and it quickly spread out of control. Unfortunately, the building didn't have a sprinkler system, and the heart of the fire that you see here on the right, that's where the library is. And the next slide here shows the library. Really, really sad loss. That incredible space was completely consumed by the fire. And next view shows in 2018 they began a restoration. Fortunately, the fire was mostly contained to that one end of the building. The fire department did a fantastic job of getting there and striking the fire and controlling it and preventing it from spreading to the rest of the building. And afterwards, you know, the school and Scotland, they all said, hey, we're rebuilding. The library was documented very, very thoroughly. So they said, we're going to rebuild this, no problem. You know, yes, we lost some historic material, but we can really recreate this. And so this is how it looked in 2018. They were finishing up some of the restoration, and in fact, the school was to open fall of 2018, and then this happened. Another fire. Just really unbelievable. And this one was even worse. I still haven't really heard what happened, how this one started. Fires are not, unfortunately, uncommon during construction. And I don't think it was intentionally set or anything. The whole building had been wrapped in scaffold or something, and so it just spread throughout. And this time they could not contain it, and the building is just significantly gutted. The exterior stone walls are intact. Some of the ironwork that you see glow, you know, in silhouette with the fire glowing behind it, some of that survived, but the entire interior was completely destroyed. I believe they're still planning to essentially rebuild, but this was just really devastating. Pretty much brought me to tears for sure. So on a happier note is Hill House, just outside of Glasgow in Helensburgh, and this is his greatest residential commission from 1902 to 1904, right at the time that Frank Lloyd Wright is emerging with his Prairie School of Architecture, to give you some context there. And this is, Mackintosh is the architect, but very much in collaboration with his wife, Margaret MacDonald. So MacDonald was an extremely talented designer. She and her sister both, they had attended the Glasgow School of Art. She and Mackintosh were married in 1900, and she really became a full partner to him. It's still fairly unusual in this time for a woman to be so prominent in architecture. She wasn't an architect herself. Mackintosh did the architecture, but he really did regard her very publicly as being an essential partner in his work. And she did many of the beautiful interiors in his projects, including here at Hill House. This is the exterior view of it. It's stone, and like we saw with Voisey and with Glasgow School of Art, it has that medieval character to it, but it is stripped down and a little more contemporary in its overall character than what Morris did at Red House. But it also has a rambling, sort of L-shaped plan with various protrusions and so forth. Here at the entry is and you come in to a grand hall here on the bottom, E, and there's a stair protrusion that sort of arcs out that gives access to the various levels. Here's a view at the exterior entry gate, more of that beautiful ironwork that Mackintosh is known for. This is the view of the entrance. Kind of interesting, many of the entrances to these houses are rather restrained. They are not big, grand, elaborate porticos that scream, enter here. And Frank Lloyd Wright would become very famous for these obscure entries that one had to follow up passage of discovery to find where the front door was. And a lot of this was intentional, both by Wright for sure and these other architects. They wanted you to experience the architecture in 3 dimensions. They didn't want you just to go up a straight line to an obvious front door. If you are moving around the site, you're seeing the building, you're seeing the architecture from 3 dimensions, which is how architecture is meant to be seen. This is a view of the back courtyard with that protruding stair hall and the leaded glass windows within that. And here's the entry hall. So just like we saw at Red House, this has this grand entrance hall that is much wider than it needs to be for a typical, hallway. And the stair, you see a little bit of the bottom of the stair here in the middle with this wood screen that allows a little bit of a vista between the stair and the hall, but also a sense of separation and enclosure. Beautiful light fixtures, and you can see some of the furniture that Mackintosh designs and is famous for here. The main living room with this incredible windows that look out over the valley beyond, more of Mackintosh's furniture, and you can see a lot more here. Margaret MacDonald's interior design and her stencils on the wall, and just the beautiful ornamentation and decoration in the house. Here's one of the bedrooms. Again, some of Mackintosh's furniture designs and MacDonald's interior designs. Okay, I'm going to stop this recording real quick